So, as always, we thank the Gillespie Samuelson Foundation and the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts. It's my pleasure today to introduce Oana David, who got her undergraduate degree at BU in anthropology, a master's degree in Japanese studies and linguistics at Oxford, and a PhD in linguistics from Berkeley, so a very nice interdisciplinary background. She's doing very interesting work in construction grammar,
I'm going to keep that little.
Okay, all right. Metaphor, cognitive linguistics, and very interesting stuff on things like data mining, automatically identifying metaphors in text. This really cool MetaNet project, which we'll be talking about. So very exciting stuff. And for today's talk, we're going to hold off on questions until the end. So with that, I introduce Oana David.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at this wonderful event, and I've been really looking forward to presenting some of this work and hearing some feedback from Merced folks and your ideas that I've gotten on and off throughout the last few weeks. This is all going to come together now, so I'm really excited. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I've been doing in collaboration with some folks, including Teeny Matlock, and including people at Berkeley and at other universities, in trying to formalize how we analyze metaphor and how we analyze metaphoric discourse in a more computational way, and in a more systematic way, and in a more big data way. So we're moving sort of away from this line-by-line discourse-analytic approach and integrating some of those insights with a more computational approach. And this is all in the context of studying metaphors for cancer in this case, because we have taken this turn now and looking at more applied ways of studying metaphor to see how people's worldviews and how their attitudes are shaped by the metaphors that they hear and the metaphors that they use. So although this is a talk about cancer metaphors, it's really a talk about metaphor theory in general, methodologies in metaphor research in general. So it's kind of like a masked metaphor theory talk. So just to go a little bit over the assumptions and the background of what we are talking about here. Here are some of the insights that we take for granted from cognitive science and from linguistics. We think that language influences thought and vice versa, but also that these two things are influenced by action and they influence action. So it's not just about sitting there thinking on your own, it's about taking those thoughts and those feelings and those attitudes and using them to do things in the world, like vote, or create medicine, or found a nonprofit organization that helps people. So all of this has real world applications, and this is why we care about this kind of stuff in broader context. In cognitive science and cognitive linguistics, more generally, we do not think of words as having inherent discrete meanings. We see words as prompts to more broad meaning fields, more broad meaning frames, as we call them, semantic frames, in the Fillmorian, the Chuck Fillmore sense. So a word will act as a prompt to a broader set of meanings, and you are not sort of processing words one by one. You're processing them in the flow of discourse, basically. And if we're talking about words as prompts to meanings, words obviously appear inside of grammatical structures, right? We don't speak word by word, we speak phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence. So we have to take into account the contribution of grammar to how we structure our meanings. So this is where we get things like construction grammar, or constructive grammar, as I'm going to call it now, because it is constructive, as the study of how these words come together and create a compositionality of meanings that have their own unique structures, independently of their separate components. And of course, as the topic of my talk suggests, there's much metaphor conceptualization. What is metaphor? Very, very broadly speaking, it's when you take some kind of less accessible meaning, like an abstract concept, like democracy or love, or just the process of thinking, and you think about it and talk about it in terms of a more accessible domain, like motion through space, object manipulation, force dynamics with objects, gravity, verticality. These are all sort of intersubjectively accessible domains that we can both verify, me as speaker and you as listener. So that's really the backbone of the conceptual metaphor theory movement, is to take this mapping from the source domain to the target domain as the basic metaphoric structure, and that gives rise to all kinds of more complex metaphors later on. So here's an outline of my talk. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about metaphor research, more specifically computational and corpus linguistic approaches to metaphor research in recent years. And then I'll talk a little bit about cancer discourse research and how cancer has been talked about in the domain of health communications and in the media and in rhetoric and in the literature, and in literature and poetic literature. And then sort of put the two together and see how we can understand more about cancer and how it's being construed via these methods that I'll be presenting and via the technologies that we're developing. And it's important to note that this is not unique to cancer talk. This work has been done in the context of other societally important issues like poverty, the gun debate and gun rights issues, and democracy, amongst many other topics. So some of the principles I'll be presenting are more broadly applicable. So what are the important questions? An important question is not, are there metaphors? Yes, there are metaphors. I just answered it, the end, we can move on. There are metaphors all the time, even in my discourse right now as I'm speaking to you. In my discourse is a container, I am using a lot of metaphor. So that's not what we're focusing on, that's not what we're trying to answer. We're trying to answer what metaphors are there, and more precisely, why those metaphors? Why is it that a particular person is using a particular metaphor at a particular time? And are there generalizations we can draw from that in terms of the identity of the speaker and the audience? And then from that, we can ask, what do speakers achieve by using particular metaphors? It begs to be mentioned here that we take it for granted that people don't consciously pick their metaphors most of the time. Most of the metaphors we use are at the unconscious level, but sometimes we do get strategic, especially if we're trying to be persuasive or if we're trying to frame a message in a particular way. Okay, so from the point of view of linguists and cognitive scientists, how do we know what conceptual metaphors people are reasoning in terms of? Or even that they are using metaphor at all. And there are three main approaches to studying this. The first is looking at linguistic clues. So this is the work of cognitive linguists, and they look at lexical choices, they look at grammatical choices, and discourse level choices. And this is mostly what I'll be talking about in what I'm presenting here. But then there's the gestural approach, where people look at co-speech gestures and see how gestures can kind of give an insight into some of the metaphors operating subconsciously that you're not explicitly saying in the words that your gestures are accompanying. So a famous study of this, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the Nunez and Sweetser work with Aymara time metaphors, where they're going like this to indicate a long, long time ago, even though they're not saying a long, long time ago, but they're going like this. This indicates that the past is actually in front and the future is behind. So yes, there is language indicating the metaphor, but the gesture is actually putting across a lot of that information. So these are some of the people that work on that. And then, of course, there are the non-linguistic or semi-linguistic tasks that try to get a metaphor without necessarily mediating through grammar or through language. Just to show that metaphor really is conceptual structure and not necessarily a linguistic or language-specific structure. Okay. So I'm going to be talking mostly about the linguistic clues. So if you're a linguistic student of metaphor, what are you looking at? What kind of linguistics are you doing? Well, you can be the armchair linguist, and you can sit there and go, I'm going to think of a metaphoric sentence now. They were struggling in their relationship and they hit a dead-end street. Okay, that sounds right. That sounds about right to me, right? That's metaphoric, and I've heard people say this. I'm going to use this as an example now to show that we reason about love in terms of journeys and in terms of streets and paths and destinations. We can take that one step further and do a more discourse-analytic approach where we take actual naturally occurring speech, conversations, news articles, and annotate line by line and say, okay, these are some of the metaphors I'm seeing here based on the words and phrases being used. We can do even more intensive quantitative work in the corpus linguistic tradition where we do concordances, we do engrams, we do collocations and word frequencies, And this is sort of zooming out from the immediate discourse context, but giving you more data to work with. And whenever you do that, you lose precision, but you gain breadth. So as I'm going through these, I'm getting more and more broad and less precise. And of course, there are the statistical seed-based approaches, which they work to a certain degree of precision, and the point is to get a better and better score. So 0.7 this time, 0.75 next time, where you use particular collocations like cancer journey to seed additional discoveries of additional metaphors from particular collections of texts. So what are some of the existing problems in metaphor research? So far, these have been not enough empirical evidence, not enough cross-linguistic evidence, not enough looking at metaphors in different domains of human reasoning and action, which is why we are expanding to looking at cancer metaphors and democracy metaphors and poverty metaphors. And when we are looking at metaphors in these domains, we have to take into account cultural models, and we have to take into account political stance and worldviews. And this becomes enormously complicated. That's where the discourse-analytic approach is useful. And all of this came up, by the way, earlier today in Matt's talk, so this is really tying in with the research already being done here. A really big problem that my research and the research of my group is trying to address is getting beyond a list-based model of metaphor. We're not just listing metaphors one by one, but we're creating structured networks of metaphors that are related in predictable ways, and then we can discover new specific instances of metaphors based on this core set. And of course, even defining metaphor is problematic. What do we know when we know that an expression is metaphoric? So here are some of the assumptions that I take and other people take. There's a conceptual metaphor that is grounded in so-called primary metaphors. And primary metaphors are arising out of primary scenes. So these are metaphors like progress is forward motion, and purposes are destinations, and difficulties in forward motion are impediments along the path to a destination. Another popular primary metaphor is affection is warmth. And these are thought to be metaphors that arise in early infancy and in the developmental period of language, when children are associating these different domains regularly and subconsciously. And then these primary metaphors are the ones that give rise to more complex metaphors like cancer is a journey, which is a more culturally understood metaphor. So a child will not acquire cancer as a journey, but cancer as a journey builds on the earlier metaphors that are primary. And I think earlier you mentioned that I should talk a little bit about the difference between metaphor and figurative language more broadly, or blends, for example. So there are other forms of figurative language that are not conceptual metaphors in this definition. But those are not really what we're looking at when we are doing this kind of research. So I can address this more in the Q&A session at the end. Just know that it's there. Metaphor is not just linguistic. It points to a conceptual reality. And some languages have these primary metaphors that I just mentioned, but they might not necessarily manifest them linguistically. So you go to a community that speaks a language that you don't know, you try to look for the metaphors and you're not hearing them. It doesn't mean that they're not there. So you have to do the gestural research, and you have to look in other ways to find them. And the really important part of this, two computational approaches to metaphor theory, is that they're regular. So you can actually formally encode them in a computational system. They're not, there's not going to be thousands of them. There's actually only a few hundred of them. And once you get those down pat, you can leverage those to find more specifics. So the basic model is when you're doing a little metaphor analysis, you do your source domain frame like this, for example, physical combat, with particular frame elements. So you have at least a fighter and another fighter and some kind of outcome to the fight. And then you have your target frame, which is the thing that you're trying to understand in terms of the source frame. So in this case, you're trying to understand cancer as a fighter, and a cancer patient as another fighter, and the disease outcome, survival or not, is the outcome of that fight. So somebody losing or winning. So when doing this kind of research computationally, there's always a trade-off between precision and breadth, as I mentioned earlier. So in a world where we have unlimited resources, and I have 3,000 or 300,000 talented metaphor analysts, and they work 24 hours a day, they can generate extremely detailed, highly precise analyses of metaphor. We can compile all of those, and let's say we generate corpora that are billions of words large, and we're happy. But we don't have those kinds of resources. So we are forced to cut down on some of the ideal that we would like and replace it with lower precision, but higher breadth. So some of the research groups that have done this kind of work, but not with 300,000 analysts, are the Praggle group, which has pioneered, at the MPI, has pioneered this famous methodology in metaphor research that you have probably read about. And in the context of cancer research, it's been the Gibbs and Frank's work. So Ray Gibbs has interviewed some women that talk about their cancer experience and done very, very in-depth discourse-analytic work over their reports. A more preferred method for people who are interested in computationally leveraging this kind of stuff is one that uses some NLP methods. So these C-based methods that I've mentioned earlier that are mainly done by Katerina Shutova, who's at the University of Cambridge right now, I believe. These have very, very wide breadth. They produce hundreds of thousands of results, but very low precision. And you're not really sure whether you're dealing with actual conceptual metaphor in the results, or whether they're just very interesting collocations of words, or other forms of figurative language. And then there's what I call the winnowing approach, which is really kind of cool. You take this collocational pattern analysis method where you search for a target word, like cure, or treat, or ailment, or disease, or cancer. And then based on the results of that, you search that for source domain words, like fight, beat, journey, win, war. And then you find the collocations within that, and you have your final list of potential metaphors. This also requires a human analyst, because the human analyst is the one who's going to go looking for this. So you still need someone who knows what they're looking at in terms of conceptual metaphor. But it's very highly focused on lexical items, and it doesn't really get at the conceptual metaphors that I spoke about earlier. So what are we really saying when we say fight cancer? Why fight cancer versus attack cancer? What's the difference there? Those are both sort of evoking this struggle, physical struggle metaphor, but in different ways. So lexically they're different, but conceptually they're sort of similar. So we want to get conceptual metaphor in the mix. And then finally, the fourth method that is starting to arise now in the context of this project that Jeff mentioned, called MetaNet, where we're trying to bring together the best of both worlds, the qualitative and the quantitative approaches. And we're trying to build a human analyst's intuitions into a computational system by creating an ontology of structures that are necessary for conceptual metaphors. So for example, in the system, all 200 primary metaphors are there, and they're interrelated to each other in a dynamic way. There is a metaphor extraction mechanism that takes these metaphors and runs over very, very large corpora, discovering metaphoric collocations in text. And then the results of that produce metaphorically scored collocations with a greater or lesser degree of metaphoricity. So it's not that it's either metaphoric or not, which is difficult to decide, right, whether something is metaphoric or not. It's to what extent does the system believe this is metaphoric on a scale of 0 to 1. So once the human analyst receives this list of results, the human analyst goes through and decides where there were false positives, and in fact this is not metaphoric at all, or whether maybe perhaps a collocation is particularly metaphoric, like attack poverty. Maybe attack poverty got a 0.3 score. In fact, it should have gotten a 0.9 score because it is highly metaphoric. And then the human analyst sort of creates a gold standard of examples, feeds them back into the system, and then refines the system so that the next time it runs, it produces better results. So that's the basic model of MetaNet. So overall, we can characterize this system as one that has large-scale data extraction capabilities into text metaphoric language that increases in accuracy over multiple iterations, and crucially mirrors human-like intuitions about what should be metaphoric, what should not be metaphoric. And I'd like to add to this that it's completely adaptable, such that if the state of the art changes and we decide that something else is actually metaphoric, those new changes can be integrated into the system too. So if somebody comes along and makes a really compelling argument that something is not metaphoric, we can adapt the system so that it reflects the new insights from the literature. Okay, so that's my sort of spiel about the state of metaphor theory and metaphor research. And now I'm just going to talk a little bit about cancer research and metaphor in cancer. So here's, I'm just going to kick it off with a quote from Susan Sontag, who wrote this wonderful book called Illness as Metaphor and AIDS and Its Metaphors a very long time ago. I think it was 1972, but I could be making that up. She says, illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of the other place. And this was the first line of the book, and then for the rest of the book she proceeded to try to convince us that we should not be using metaphor to talk about illness and to talk about cancer. But clearly she preferred to use metaphor in the beginning, and in fact she probably couldn't even avoid it, and she did a very nice job creating a very novel metaphor. And this is the cancer is a journey metaphor, right? This is the metaphor whereby you are a traveler with a passport, and there are two states that you can be in, healthy and not healthy, and sometimes you're in the healthy state / location, and other times you're in the unhealthy state / location. And in fact, research has shown that cancer is very frequently talked about as a journey in American English discourse and in British English discourse as well. And journey metaphors are more broadly a type of life as a journey. Cancer journey metaphors are more broadly a type of life as a journey metaphors, where the state of having an illness like cancer is an event in your life, and then you go from that event of having cancer to maybe being in an event of not having cancer. So you're sort of progressing through life, and every sub-portion of the life is itself a mini journey that you go through. And when we take apart the metaphor, we actually find some mappings that are very regular. So usually the diagnosis stage of the cancer journey is construed as the beginning of the journey. The treatment phase is construed as the path. So you have expressions like course of treatment, right, the course. And the end of life care is the end of the journey. Sometimes you have people saying the end of the journey to talk about the recovery stage. It's ambiguous. In fact, if you go through the blogs, people say, I've reached the end of my journey, and you have a mixture of feedback at the bottom of the page, going, oh, I'm so sorry. It's like, no, I'm at the end of my journey. I'm recovering now. So it could go either way. Sometimes the remission, the survival stage, is seen as overcoming some obstacle in the path, and that obstacle is usually that really, really hard part of the cancer suffering process. Doctors and loved ones are seen as guides and companions, and the illness itself is sometimes construed as a companion.
Shouldn't the illness be the environment, though, usually?
So speakers get really creative with how they construe it, and sometimes they get contradictory in the same discourse. So earlier on they might say, my beloved companion in this journey, referring to the loved one, and then later they might say, and this god-awful companion that I have in life, meaning the cancer. So yes, people do mix metaphors, and that's a really interesting phenomenon too. So that's one side of the metaphor coin in terms of cancer, and the other side is we do use a lot of war and fighting metaphors, and in fact most of the literature on metaphor and cancer is about the war metaphor. So even if you just peruse through the Amazon book selection on cancer, self-help books, and other specialized books, it's just full of war metaphors, struggling, battle, etc., etc. Now, the actual experimental work on metaphoricist role in cancer discourse is very limited. This is one of the papers, or series of papers of the Semino et al., which I recommended to some of you to read before this talk. And in this paper, they find that patients use both war and journey metaphors more than healthcare professionals, but more so journey metaphors. So that's understandable, right? The healthcare professionals are probably using a lot of dry language, a lot of neutral language, and it makes sense that the patients would be using more of both. And it's also interesting that overall the war metaphors are preferred over the journey metaphors by either patients or doctors. So it's a very limited series of results. It's just the Semino papers, the Semino et al. Papers, and also this one that I wanted to mention, the Hauser and Schwartz, which is a couple of experimental studies they did showing that war metaphors are likely to cause healthy individuals to take fewer preventative measures, or to not want to actively take preventative measures to stave off cancer. So it's not really looking at cancer patients. It's looking at people who don't have cancer, which kind of suggests that cancer is inevitable, so what would you do to avoid it? It's somewhere down the path, and it's forcing people to sort of simulate what they would have to do to avoid that path. And that's it. This is the research on cancer. Ta-da! Very short list. Most of the other items in the literature are by oncologists, science experts in the media who want to discuss current approaches to cancer treatment, who have concerns, and they express concerns about using the war metaphors too heavily. So this opens a lot of questions and a lot of doors for research. First of all, do different speakers use different metaphors at different times? So even within cancer patients, we can't just say cancer patients, that's too broad of a category. There are people who are just diagnosed. There are people who have had cancer for many years and they've been living with it for many years. There are people in remission and they talk about cancer in different ways. They use different metaphors. So I really like this one popular article by Wendy Hartman named, or called Misguided Metaphor in the Oncology Times, 2007. And she really points out that, that we really need to be paying attention to the identity of the speaker. So if it's somebody who says, she says, the battle metaphor doesn't work well for me as a patient, but that's not the upsetting part. It's this notion of losing. So even a patient in the middle of struggling with cancer might find it discouraging to think about it as a war. But it gets even worse. If you're a patient who is terminally ill and you have absolutely no hope, then it really is counterproductive to think about it as a war. So she says, why do I get worked up about losing? So why do I get worked up about losing her battle? Because in the context of end-stage illness, this metaphor is seriously flawed in two ways. First, no victor emerges from the battlefield of hospice, and then she talks about how there is harm that this metaphor does to patients in their final days and to their loved ones left behind. So again, yes, there are war metaphors, but most likely not coming from these sets of patients. And there's a very strong active push to not use these metaphors with these kinds of patients. So another issue to really consider here is what precisely about cancer is being discussed. Is it cancer as a personal problem or lifestyle, or is it dealing with cancer at a societal level with policies and governmental tactics? These are very, very different, right? If you're talking about your own cancer experience versus if you're talking about some law that was just introduced to make more funds available to cancer research. Or you can zoom in on the cancer patient, him or herself, and look at the cancer patient as a battleground for the cancer itself, and talk about the cancer spreading through the body, which is a whole other set of metaphors, or the cancer eating at somebody. So that's more of a bodily focus of the cancer. It's not so much about the psychological struggle or the lifestyle or the path of life. It's about the actual pain and the actual anatomy and the physiology of cancer. So what do we mean when we say cancer is a war? What are the mappings in these two different ways of looking at cancer as a war? So I'll take this excerpt from, where is is from Scott. I feel as though I have two enemies inside. One is the disease, one is the treatment that kills the tumor, but I fear that it will kill me first, and after that, the tumor. That's what I feel. You have to be strong to handle both. And that's a very, very different way of talking about cancer as a battle than the war on cancer. Since 1971, when President Nixon announced the war on cancer with the signing of the National Cancer Act, we have seen an increase of over 300,000 in the number of survivors, which is now reaching more than 12 million in the United States. So there, the mappings are a little bit different from here. Here, cancer is seen as a societal problem, which is the enemy of the members of that society. The society members are the protagonists in the war, so not the enemy, the other person. And the policies and society level actions are the weapons in the war. A completely different set of mappings from the tumor seen as the enemy of a patient and the enemy of a treatment, because she's doing a construal of battle between two different sets of enemies. The treatment is the enemy of the patient or the enemy of the tumor. And the patient is the protagonist, but also acts as the battleground of the tumor fighting treatment. It is a genuinely mixed metaphor right there. She is putting together two completely different sets of mappings in one. So these are the kinds of questions we should be asking when we talk about cancer as a war. What do we mean? Which war? Okay, so to try to answer some of these questions, I'm looking at this using both traditional corpus linguistic methods, which includes collocations, frequencies, and concordances, and n-grams, and the like, and MetaNet, which I have just finished introducing, and some of the hybrid techniques that are a part of MetaNet. I'm putting here, and I'm sure that I can make my slides available to you, and in any case, I can make these links available to you. We do have a public wiki site for the MetaNet project, on the project site, and I put all my links on my site if you want to take a look. So I am using these sets of corpora, which are called the 1010 Webcorpora. The reason is, number one, they are extremely large. These are the largest corpora that exist. They were they were actually produced as a scraping of the internet on a series of days in that year. So they just left the machine running for like a week and scraped the entire internet. And then cleaned it up. They compiled it using Spiderlink. They cleaned it, they deduplicated it, so there are no duplicated links in the entire corpus. And they used TreeTagger as their tagger. And more importantly, for my interests, they did this for multiple languages, which is unbelievably useful. And for all of them, they have billions of words. And in most studies, most corpus studies of metaphor, you see things in the hundreds of thousands and in the millions of words. And here we're talking about billions of words. So we're getting really kind of good numbers. In spite of there being billions of words, we're getting very small numbers of hits for particular collocations of interest for specific domains. So here, this is where the relevance of grammar in the study of metaphor becomes important. Because when you're doing collocational research, you're not just putting two random words together. You are kind of interested how those words occur grammatically relative to each other. So in the sketch engine tool that I use to scrape these, they actually do categorize these collocations in terms of their grammatical structures. And here I'm comparing a verb plus direct object, cancer, so battle cancer, attack cancer, in English with Spanish. And this is showing the raw frequencies. This is the total frequencies, but I haven't listed all of the words. These are just the ones pertaining to fighting, battling, tackling, all of the violence verbs. In English and in Spanish, so we have combatir, vencer, enfrentar, extirpar, avanzar, atacar, derrotar, destruir, abordar. Some of the same words in both, but with different frequencies. These columns log dice. This is a lexical association measure that shows how likely this particular collocation is to exist. So this is actually a better indicator of salience than the raw frequency, because the raw frequencies, as you can see, are very small. And they're very small relative to the total as well. So in English, we're seeing some very, very large association scores. And in Spanish, maybe not as high, but still kind of high. But importantly, when I scraped this for English, I just took the battle metaphors and the war metaphors, but those were not the highest scoring metaphors. There were journey metaphors that were scoring higher, and other metaphors. But for Spanish, these were the highest scoring metaphors, and they're already scoring quite low, or quite mediocre. So that's kind of an interesting distinction right there between Spanish and English. Going to show that it's important to do cross-linguistic work like this, also taking into account the grammatical patterns that we're looking at. We can't just look at random locations of words. Can I wait till the end? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, then I did this collocation for the effects of grammar in a, this is a copular construction, so cancer is a, complete the sentence. And in English, we have quite a variety of cancer is a killer, cancer is a gift, a battle, an enemy, a journey, a fight, an asshole, a burden, a mystery, a bitch. They're very, very few. So there were this many hits of cancer, but there were only 18 of, there were like less than 50, 52 for most of them. Killer is the most frequent one with 287. But importantly, what we note here is that the association of war metaphors is much lower when in the copular construction than in the verb plus object construction. So it really makes a difference what grammatical construction we're looking at. If I wanted to research cancer metaphors in English and only looked at copular constructions, I would get the conclusion that war metaphors are really not that important in English. So it really makes a difference to categorize the data in terms of the grammar as well. I also found these kind of cool other sort of marginal metaphors, like cancer is a game of odds, which are very, very few, but it is possible to talk about cancer in other metaphoric ways that are not war or journey. And these kinds of methods help us discover what some of those ways of talking about it are if we look at the lower frequencies. So we can't just look at the top 5. Okay. Now, when we look at this stuff cross-linguistically, war metaphors are most salient in English. They are also salient in Spanish, although maybe not to the same extent. I also looked at Japanese, and just out of curiosity, I looked at Romanian, which is another Romance language like Spanish, because I thought, oh, surely, it's going to be just like Spanish. No, it is not. I'm hard-pressed to find war metaphors in Romanian. We do not get things like war on cancer, or to have a war with cancer. We do see some of the fighting with, as in a hand-to-hand lucha, or lupta, as we say. To hit cancer, I'm not sure that exists much. But in Japanese, interestingly enough, we do get a lot of very vivid, direct hand-to-hand combat, individual to individual, not so much larger wars with strategies and weapons, but a lot of physical combat between two people. So we get a lot of hit cancer or slap cancer. We have things like extinguish cancer, do away with cancer, things like that. In the journey domain, we do see a lot of life is a journey extensions in English. And in Japanese, it's not so much the notion of journey as this long, drawn-out process where you have a final destination and you maybe have a companion, but it's more about the immediate motion process, walking along a path and then finding obstacles along the path in your way. So we get things like gan wo tobasu means to take the cancer and make it fly. So it's like launching it or making it go away from you. We talk about koeru, which is like surpass, and nori koeru, which means ride and surpass. So you get this compound verb with two different events. And the journey metaphors are just completely not present in Romanian. At least they're not discoverable through the term cancer. So if I search for the word cancer, there's no journeying language surrounding the term cancer. So these are some of the cross-linguistic differences that are arising, meaning or begging the question then, are these patients reasoning about their cancer in different ways? Because Romanian speakers don't have the journey metaphors, are they dealing with their cancer in a different way? Are they appealing to a different metaphor system? Or are they just suffering more because they don't have an outlet? So these are some of the research questions that are then produced on the basis of this metamarker. Okay, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about how MetaNet and a hybrid system like MetaNet can help us do some of this work in a way that is both qualitative and quantitative, and can help scrape larger data sets. So just to give an overview of the architecture of MetaNet, it's a database of manually entered so-called schemas, which are frames, semantic frames that have a structure with roles. So for example, the journey frame would have a journeyer, a path of journeying, a destination, a source of the journey, and that would be the schema. And then, so this is very similar to FrameNet. If any of you are familiar with FrameNet, this is the same kind of structure. Then we also have metaphors, which are frame-to-frame mappings, systematically related to each other in the wiki that we produced. And we did this for 4 languages, so English is just one of them. We also have Persian, Russian, and Spanish, specifically for Mexico. And we have, obviously, a big discrepancy in numbers here. Clearly, it's a lot harder to work with Persian data. In fact, one of the reasons we have less Persian data is because of the internet being blocked. So yeah, that was a real problem. But really, more importantly, with Persian and Russian, it's a character issue. The characters are really hard to work with. And then we have 732 metaphors for English and 627 schemas. And I need to talk a little bit about how we transition from the theory of metaphor and how mappings work and how we encode that in the system. So we assume that lexical items and expressions evoke frames. And in turn, those frames populate the source domain and the target domain of a metaphor. So this creates a really nice little connect A to B kind of puzzle. And then those source and target domains actually occur in predictable patterns that are grammatical. So now we are connecting lexical items to frames, frames to metaphors, and metaphors to grammatical patterns. And this is our way into the corpus data. This is how we are able to scrape the corpus data. So here's just a little visualization of how that would work, but this is not a cancer metaphor. I just took this from a different set of slides, sorry. But this is poverty as a disease. Poverty as a disease has a source frame, which is disease, a target frame, which is poverty. And then poverty as a disease is itself a subcase of social problems or physical afflictions at a higher level of conceptualization. Other kinds of physical afflictions that are social problems include crime and drugs. So you can see how this might produce subcase relations for other metaphors as well. And then the lexical items are associated with the frames. So poverty has the lexical items poverty, impoverishment, destitution, indigence. Disease has disease, illness, sickness, sick, etc. And the lists are augmentable in the system, so we can always add new words if we find them. And then the frames themselves have subcase relations. So poverty is a subcase of social problem, which feeds this target domain up here. And disease is a subcase of physical affliction, which feeds the source domain in the higher metaphor. And everything is interrelated in this way in a very, very massive network system. These are some of the grammatical patterns that the system uses to find collocations in texts. It uses subject-verb constructions like cancer strikes, verb-direct object like battle cancer, verb prepositional phrase like move beyond cancer or battle with cancer, the noun of noun construction, onslaught of disease, the possessive, cancer's journey, war on cancer, which is a noun prepositional phrase, the very, very common noun-noun construction, which cancer journey is the most frequent for, adjective noun, hostile disease, and copular. Cancer is a very aggressive opponent. And the grammar pattern list itself is augmentable. So for example, we do not have any passive constructions. So destroyed by cancer would not be able to be found in the system, but we can add it and it will be incorporated. So as I mentioned, there are predictable ways of matching metaphors to grammatical patterns. So if you have a noun-noun construction like cancer journey or cancer cure, it's always the first noun that's going to evoke the target domain of the metaphor, and it's always the second noun that's going to evoke the source domain of the metaphor, and that's the rule. So we don't have to worry about finding anything that doesn't match this pattern, or missing something that doesn't match this pattern. Oops, the constructional patterns are necessary constraints on metaphoric language, but are not sufficient constraints to guarantee metaphoricity. So at the very least, this is finding this very limited set of metaphors and this very limited set of grammatical patterns, which is already quite a lot. And then we could always worry about adding more as needed and as we discover them. This is a snapshot of the Metaphor Wiki, the MetaNet Wiki, and some of the ways that you can interact with the MetaNet Wiki. So this one is for a frame. This is for the cancer frame specifically. It's listed as a subcase of the disease frame. The disease frame is live, so you can click on it and go to the disease frame, open it independently. And then at the very bottom, it shows you for what metaphors this frame is a target frame for and which metaphors it's a source frame for. So in the system, cancer as a frame is the target frame for cancer is a journey, cancer is physical combat, surviving cancer is harming cancer, surviving cancer is winning a competition. There are some frames that can be both source and target. So for example, we can use cancer as a source domain for some metaphors. Like for example,
taxes are cancer.
Taxes are a cancer spreading through the nation, yeah, exactly. In which case that would appear here, taxes are cancer. And then as far as the entries for the metaphors go, we have entries for the source frame, which is physical combat, target frame, which is cancer. We have a place where we can list the mappings. And then the most important part of the metaphor entry is the part where we relate that metaphor to other metaphors in the network, because that gives it its location, its address in that network. So here, cancer is physical combat is related to cancer patient is physical combatant. And then I didn't take a screenshot lower down, but the next one down would be cancer is a, social problems are physical afflictions would be the next one up. Which would be the subcase relation that would be most important in locating this metaphor in the rest of the network. So when we look at things that way, and we have this hierarchical relational system of metaphors, and they're not just a list, then all of a sudden it's not so outlandish why people are using war metaphors and journey metaphors. We can actually contextualize these two very specific metaphors, culturally specific metaphors, in a broader network of more generalizable metaphors that could potentially exist in other languages. So in this case, cancer is a journey is related to life as a journey, which itself is a subcase of action is motion and progress is forward motion. And that is at a very, very high conceptually schematic level. And cancer is war is a subcase of cancer is physical combat, which itself is cancer is physical competition, which is action is an interaction with an entity. So when you're having a physical competition, you're not moving per se, but you're interacting with some other entity out there in the world. And the more specific metaphors that we see in the corpus data, like the cancer monster or the cancer race, is actually, these data points are actually evoking metaphors that themselves are contextualized in this broader system. And we see why cancer is a race is closer to cancer is war and not to cancer is a journey, because they're in different neighborhoods in the relational network. It also opens up the possibility of discovering new and creative metaphors. So if one day somebody decides to call cancer an octopus, and the addressee of that statement understands instantly what is meant, It's probably because cancer is an octopus is a subcase of cancer is a monster. And the octopus is a subtype of monster. It's a sea-dwelling monster. So here I just took a snapshot of, don't worry about reading the details here. This is just to give you a neighborhood view of some of the action is motion, progress is forward motion metaphor system. And this is just a very, very small slice of it. As you can see, we have arrows going off to the sides, and if we were actually in the wiki, I could scroll back and forth. If I put the whole thing up, it would cover the entire wall. But as you add more metaphors to this, they are themselves linked up to the system and interactable. So I can actually click on these and go to that metaphor and open up the entry. The next step in the MetaNet system is to take that database of metaphors and implement them in scraping corpora for metaphor collocational patterns. We did a couple of pilot studies for cancer metaphors. We used the GLOBE, the Global Web-Based English Corpus of American Blogs. And we also made a custom corpus scraped from 3 cancer patient forums, which is very small. It's 656,000 words. This one is probably a little bit better than GLOBE because it's concentrated cancer data. This is sure to be very potent cancer data. So what happens is the corpus data is pre-processed. It's put through a lemmatizer, a tagger, a dependency parser. It's put through this entire mechanism of stuff that is standard NLP practice. And then on the other hand, the extraction mechanism is running the MetaNet wiki over this data and spitting out sentences that it thinks are that include metaphoric language to a certain degree of certainty and produces a so-called metaphoricity score. So a really good metaphoricity score would be anything over 0.7, and we found that 0.7 is actually a pretty decent metaphoricity score. A 0.7 would be something like battle cancer, attack cancer, cancer destroys lives, things like that. And so all of this, all these corpora are fed into the pre-processing. The custom system produces the metaphoricity score, and then that links up to the conceptual metaphors in the MetaNet wiki. And we get to see what the actual conceptual metaphors are relative to the linguistic collocations in the data. When we did this for cancer data, these were the basic results. These are binned by whether they pertain to physical combat more broadly, competition more broadly, journeys more broadly, disease motion, so this is like the cancer spreads or the cancer grows through your body, and other, whatever that may be. And in keeping with the results from the existing literature that I presented earlier, we see that physical combat outweighs journey metaphors by a lot. And we took apart physical combat and competition because you could talk about winning the war, cancer won, or I lost against cancer, and not have it necessarily be about an actual fight. So it could just be a competition more broadly. Here are the same results, but with the bars taken apart with a little bit more fine-grained semantic distinction amongst the lexical items. So all of these words are pertaining to attacking. All of these words are pertaining to physical combat. All of these words are about war. These words are about burdens, so load, the cancer load, or be overburdened with cancer, or the stress of cancer. This is competition, and this is journey. So just from this, it's very informative to see that there's very little lexical diversity in the journey metaphors, and very much lexical diversity in the metaphors pertaining to wars and physical combat, which is very informative. Here are the results produced in terms of the metaphors themselves, the conceptual metaphors, and not the lexical items. So over here we have war metaphors such as cancer is physical combat, surviving cancer is harming cancer, cancer treatment is war, harm is physical injury. We have one bar for competition, which is surviving cancer is winning a competition. These bars here pertain to motion, so processes are movements, diseases are burdens, action is being in a location, cancer is a journey, end of an action is the end of a path. And this one has to do with object manipulation. So encouragement is physical support. So that's all the support metaphors. Curing disease is stopping motion. Actually, sorry, I'm going to recategorize that one. That one belongs over here because it has to do with motion. But I think the reason it got put with object manipulation is because it has to do with obstacles in the way, and taking away obstacles and manipulating obstacles, which is object manipulation. The way that we interact with the corpus data results, once the extractor has done its scraping, is through a program called Mr. Viewer. It was originally called the Metaphor Repository Viewer, MR Viewer, so we called it Mr. Viewer, like Mr. Coffee. And in this form, you can actually see the individual sentences with the source domain highlighted in red and the target domain highlighted in green. And you can search over the data using this form by lexical item or by conceptual metaphor. So these are just some of the results from Mr. Viewer. These examples have to do with, actually this is just a mixed bag of examples. This is about journeys and wars, defeating cancer, cancer journey, cancer attacks, etc. Then if you are really interested in one of the examples and you want to know more about it, you can click on that example. And it gives you a breakdown of some of the syntactic and semantic properties of that sentence. So it gives you the dependency parser visualized like this. It gives you the source domain lexical item, the source domain frame, the target domain lexical item and frame. And it gives you the score of that particular extraction instance, which in this case is 0.951 for the sentence, "Help me in the fight against cancer." And it gives you the grammatical construction that was used by the program to find that example. Okay, so these are just more examples of the same. I won't go through them. This one is a selection of examples that were found that pertain to a more focused view on the body. So here we have catch the cancer at its earliest stages, where it's like this entity that you catch. Or you can slow down the cancer, or you can contain the cancer. So in all of these cases, your body is seen as this container, this area where your cancer is occupying. It can spread, it can move, and it's your job to deal with that and slow it down. And then there are other source domains that if you run the extractor with a wildcard for source domain, you can find some interesting things. So if you don't limit it by saying, I want journey and I want war metaphors, and you say, I want all kinds of, anything you can give me in the source domain, it'll find stuff like the shadow of cancer. Also, that's a light metaphor, where I guess negative would be dark and positive would be light. So one of the pluses of this technique is that you can discover maybe new patterns that you weren't actually looking for if you know how to fine-tune the system to look for wildcards. Okay, so what are some of the weaknesses or drawbacks, or however you want to call them, of the MetaNet system, as opposed to, say, the 300,000 analysts doing discourse analysis for a perfect precision kind of approach? That's the ideal. Well, in MetaNet, you only really find the metaphors you're looking for. So you have to do the discourse-analytic portion ahead of time to know what metaphors might be there, and then build the metaphors into the system so that the extractor can find them once it's looking for them. So at the very, very beginning, we actually used the literature and additional discourse analysis to find the metaphors and build them in. And this is the inventory of metaphors currently in the system for cancer specifically. Other problems are that frames are not predefined as a source or a target for a metaphor. So cancer is not, there's no place in the system where it says cancer must be a source domain. The job of the grammatical construction is to determine whether this is a source or the target. So because cancer can be both source and target, as we saw earlier, this might give some false positives, like taxation is a cancer on society, when you're actually looking for cancer is a burden. on this patient. Kind of thing. Another drawback is that you need incredibly large amounts of corpus scraping to get just a little bit of data. And for the custom corpus that I showed you, the 700,000 word corpus, we only got 1,000 hits. And of the 1,000 hits, a great many of them were false positives. So you just have to scale up higher and higher and higher if you want to get more and more data. And another drawback is there's a limited detection of metaphor when target domain lexical item is not present. But it's not impossible. So what do I mean by that? Well, actually, let me just show you the example sentences. Take sentences like this. I just want to help in any way I can, since we're all in this mysterious journey searching for the hope of light at the end of the tunnel. And at no point in this sentence was the word cancer mentioned, but we know they're talking about cancer. And the only way that this sentence would be picked up, usually, is because the word cancer or something cancer related is present as well. This one might have been picked up because something earlier in the discourse contained the word cancer, but we just got lucky. And we don't want things to be based on luck. We want to be systematic about this. So one of the next goals is to try to figure out how to deal with examples like this, where the target domain is not explicitly mentioned, but it's still very, very potently metaphoric. Okay, so just to summarize and to look forward in this body of research, we really want to use this technology to address the big questions. And those questions are, do speakers differ in what metaphors they use and how much they even use metaphor at all? We had discussions earlier today in Matt's talk. We had discussions at the Metaphor for the Common Good about how frequent are metaphors by women versus men, how frequent are metaphors in the media versus regular citizens talking about their condition, et cetera, et cetera. Those are really important questions. And can we use this information to provide better treatment and to provide psychological counseling? Would choice of words help sort of drive action in one way or another, or a course of treatment in one way or another? Are there metaphors we're not taking advantage of, we're not even on our radar? The kind of system that I've detailed here could potentially be used to find novel metaphors that patients are getting creative with in their own verbal discourse on their condition. And finally, what about cross-linguistic variety? What can we learn about human cognition by looking at the same sets of metaphors across different languages, or even just narrowing it down to the same target domain and leaving it open-ended to try to discover creative ways in which people are talking about important issues like cancer and poverty and immigration. So that's the spiel. I would like to take this opportunity to thank very, very many people that were part of this work. Elise Stickles, Eve Sweetser, Ellen Dodge. That's not Luca. I didn't have a picture of Luca, so I typed handsome Italian men. And I took the most handsome one that I could find. So thank you, Luca, who is the engineer who created Mr. Viewer and many, many other technologies in MetaNet. George Lakoff, Jisub Hong, and Carrie Mormon, who's right here. And also thank you, Tini, Matlock, and Lab, who have given me so much feedback and who have contributed to this work over the years. And ICSI, and the Metaphor for the Common Good that just happened recently. And of course, all that grant stuff, which is very important as well. Thank you so much.